Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salamu ala khair al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'd like to thank you for both the introduction as well as having this important gathering for us at this critical time. I would like maybe first to go through some of the early history of Palestine and then focus on the latter years, specifically post-Oslo Agreement, in order for us to understand the contemporary period. So to begin with, Palestine is one of the oldest regions in the world. So much so that when we speak about what is the oldest city in the world, it's actually often is spoken of to be Damascus as the oldest continuously inhabited city. But the oldest place where a human being developed a city is the city of Jericho or Ariha in the Jordan Valley. And that, in essence, is the first place where we have human beings actually developing a city and a type of sedentary living. Archaeologists are almost in consensus on that point. And then if we speak about the region in general, this is the region where what we call the birthplace of civilization, whether it's Mesopotamia, the Bilad al-Sham, the Fertile Crescent, or the Nile Valley in Egypt. Then we also speak about India and China. Second point on this, the oldest olive tree in the world today is still in Palestine. Some put the estimate of it to be 8,000 years. Some would actually put it much later at 6,000. But between 5,000 to 8,000 years is the date of the oldest olive tree in the world, and that is also in Palestine. It is a place where it has had the agricultural development of agriculture, domestication of animals, creating canals for irrigation. Even the early development of language and alphabet also could be dated in there. That's no longer, again, it's no longer disputed in any way by archaeologists. So there's a lot of things that could be subject to arguments or discussion. But in general, this is almost an acceptable base of knowledge in general. If we think about who are the oldest populations to have lived in Palestine, again, undisputed that the earliest inhabitants of this land are people that are all called the Canaanites. It's actually an Arabic term, al-Kan'aniyun. The Canaanites are the oldest population, and even if we think about the biblical text, Old Text, it refers back to the land of the Canaanites. The Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, who originated from Iraq or Mesopotamia, migrated to the land of the Canaanites. The biblical text speaks, he spoke the language of the Canaanites. He lived as an alien among the Canaanites. And even when he arrived in this area, he met the king of the Canaanites in there. So that's, again, is undisputed in relations to the oldest population. Often there's an attempt to privilege only later text, meaning privileging only the biblical narrative. And the biblical narrative, whether you date it in 1000 BC or a little bit earlier or later, that cuts close to 12,000 years out of the history of the region. So there's a problem in using that reference and dating it. So many people begin to use that as a historical reference rather than looking at archaeological research, even though that archaeology of 18th, 19th century was predominantly done with a Orientalist, often colonial paradigm, and up to the 1970s, the field of archaeology, anthropology, and others were marked by Orientalist outlook, facilitating and helping colonization. But nevertheless, that the research in archaeology, the research that have developed thereafter points to this long history in Palestine. So we need to actually often, when people speak, we need to say what vantage point, which set of either texts or what set of historical material you are using. Most people, including again most of the Zionists, who ironically, Zionism started as a secular atheist movement that did not have a belief in God, or at least did not center itself with the belief of God, but nevertheless believed that God promised them the land, which is again is a contradiction in there. So we need to find out what is the vantage point of departure that people use. If it's the biblical text, then we could actually begin to understand where this reference is actually erasing close to 12,000 years of history of the Canaanites, which is one of the main components of the early inhabitants of Palestine, and then moving to the period thereafter. So that's a very important grounding point, is actually to insist, right? We need to insist on Palestinian history that is driven by the land itself and the population that lived in it pre-arrival of whether the period of Abraham alayhi salam, or at a later point with the arrival of the descendants of Musa alayhi salam, which is at a later point rather than earlier. This is not to look or examine the significance of the religious text, but the religious text should not be used as a way to silence the history that existed in a much earlier period than this. So this is again very important in this way. Now the third point is history always privileges written text, and one way to think of it is in relations to indigenous peoples in the Americas today. The fact that we don't have a written text from the indigenous people, most of what we know about the indigenous people is written by the settler colonialists that arrived and committed genocide against them. Similarly, again, which is on a positive side, some of our black communities that arrived in here in enslavement, actually we do have a written text from them, mostly in Arabic. So we could actually reference to their experience, especially Umar ibn Sa'id biography, Ayub bin Sulaiman who wrote his biography. So history privileges written text. So in this sense, the fact that religious text was written, the biblical text, both Old Testament and New Testament, makes the ability to look at earlier history very difficult, and that's why we heavily depend on archaeology for navigating some earlier history of Palestine, and it becomes an important. I think Keith Whitelam, The Inventing of Ancient Israel, is a very important book, because that invention likewise takes place in order to narrate a particular history in that way, to privilege a particular narration that almost corresponds to what Zionism wanted to do and wanted to undertake. Now I want to jump into the period of the 19th century and in the 20th century. Zionism is born in the late 19th century. The idea of reconstituting or creating a Jewish state was a preoccupation first and foremost by Christian theologians of the West. So it's very important. Even when we speak about Napoleon arriving into Egypt in 1798, he actually wrote and invited the Jews of the East to support his campaign with the offer or with the idea that he will reconstitute the Jews into Palestine. They rebuffed him, but that was present in relations to this idea of reconstituting the Jews to Israel, or to reconstituting Jews to Palestine, to call it Israel, as a stepping stone for what they considered to be forcing the hand of God for the end of times. And that was Christian theologians that were actually pushing this idea, motivated by theologically, but for Great Britain and the others were motivated purely by colonial consideration. So Zionism, very important for us to understand, was born within the Western world and a child of Western epistemology, and also born within the colonial era and the colonial period within Western thought. Now, the fact that it took a nationalist undertaking is also could be added. But the 19th century was the high season of European colonization. Most of the world was colonized at that point. And it's critical that 1884, we have the Paris Conference to divvy up Africa between the European powers, and Africa became a colony, north, south, east, west. Only a small area around Ethiopia and a small area around Liberia that actually ends up not being a colony, but all of Africa was divvied up. Zionism is born around that same time period. Just before the Paris Conference, we begin to have the first initial settlements in Palestine. So early settlements, 1876, that the settlements begin to take shape with the idea of colonization supported by European powers for their own purposes. It is not surprising that the discourse from early on of Zionism was a colonial discourse. And I reference an important letter that is written by Herzl to Cecil Rhodes. He actually writes a letter, appears in his the collection of his memoirs. In essence says, why do I turn to you in such a matter? He's writing to Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was the Minister of Colonies of Britain at the time. He says, because it is something colonial. So Herzl was speaking in colonial terms. Cecil Rhodes, for those who don't know, was the Minister of Colonies of Great Britain at the time. And he had the temerity to have a country named on his behalf. The country is Rhodesia, which gained its independence in the early 70s and became called Zimbabwe. So literally, Cecil Rhodes, who was Minister of Colony, he actually wanted to create a road from South Africa all the way to Cairo. It was that type of epistemology that informed Zionism and wanted to shape the conquest of Palestine and take over Palestine with a colonial outlook. Now, for the British had their own interest. The British were looking at securing their loot from India. The British were the colonial power in India. By 1882, they were the colonial power in Egypt, which included also the campaign later on to take over Sudan. And the British were concerned about their trade and the resources that were taken out of from India. The British took about close to $45 trillion worth of wealth out of India. When they arrived in India, India was 24% of the global GDP. By the time they left, it was reduced to 3%. And in 1869, they opened the Suez Canal. So they thought of a buffer state. And even the idea or the concept of Middle East is born out of British thinking of how to secure their trade and their pillaging of resources from India. So the concept of Middle East developed out of the India British office, having already have the Far East and the Middle East and the Near East. And that's how the plan for all the resources and all of their trade was passing through the Suez Canal. So even as we speak today, the United States is rallying countries, around 38 countries, to try to protect the Bab el-Mandeb at the south with Yemen, because that accounts for 16% of the global trade passes through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal. So it's a very, very important strategic point. So the British wanted a buffer state to protect the Suez Canal. But the second part of that is deep anti-Semitism that were present in not only in Great Britain, but across Europe. The Europeans have always anti-Semitic and continue to be so. So it was even Balfour himself, who issued the Balfour Declaration, was deeply an anti-Semitic person. He had expressed time and time again complaining about the number of Jews that were present in the UK. And in Europe, there were two questions that were part of the two racist questions, we may say. One was the Jewish question, meaning the anti-Semitism. And the second is the Eastern questions, which is the Muslim questions and the Ottomans. And that's why the Ottomans were seen as the sick man of Europe. So the British, in developing and incubating Zionism, were thinking strategically of their own interests, striking not two birds with one stone, but trying to have two camels with one jockey, in this sense being the British, in a sense securing their trade and then putting the Jewish population in Palestine, which may say that when the British arrived in Palestine during World War I, they actually framed their campaign within a crusading terminology. They referenced the Crusades. This is the end of the Crusades. This is coming back to Palestine after 672 years of Muslim control. So that dynamic has to be understood if what the British motivation in arriving or in incubating Palestine as a settler colony for Zionism, and Zionism becoming a junior partner with the British. So the British adopt Zionism, and they begin to actually strategize and work to implement it. And that's where it gets us into the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is an agreement that is struck between the British and the French to divvy up territories that belongs to the Ottomans. These territories includes what we call the Syrian Peninsula. It includes Iraq, includes even part of the coastal areas all the way to Yemen. But the Sykes-Picot Agreement divvied up in particular Iraq and the Fertile Crescent. Part of it is to be delineated to be to the French, and part of it is to be delineated to be for the British. In the build-up to both World War I and to the outcome of World War I, they also struck a deal with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Sharif Hussein of Mecca was recruited into the British campaign in order for him to launch a revolt against the Ottomans. This what came to be called as the Great Arab Revolt in the language of those who benefited from it. But in general, I always say the Great Arab Revolt was not great, nor was it Arab. It was T.E. Lawrence, a British intelligence officer that was operating out of the Cairo office. He came with the idea of fomenting an Arab rebellion in the southern Ottoman provinces in order to disrupt the supply route of the Ottoman army, in order to allow for the British forces to come out of Egypt and to land from the Mediterranean. The other part is also they needed Sharif Hussein because of his legitimacy, being an Arab descendant of the Prophet ﷺ family. The reason is that both the French and the British armies had large Muslim troops were recruited from the colonies. Right? So these were colonial troops in the hundreds of thousands that were recruited across World War I. We failed to recognize this. So many of the troops were hesitant to fight against the Ottomans, who were representing and holding the flag bearer of the Muslim world. And therefore, the British made a promise in correspondence between Sharif Hussein and McMahon of the British Foreign Office that the British will actually declare Sharif Hussein to be the new caliph. Right? I know if people think that Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd is actually in the Muslim world, in Mecca or in Cairo, it seems that Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd were sitting in London drinking afternoon tea, so they could appoint who's going to be the Khalifa or not. Not dissimilar to what happens today in across many parts. But the end of the story is this campaign by Sharif Hussein ended up allowing the British to occupy Palestine. There's an important dating in here that has to be understood. The Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2nd, 1917. The British entered and occupied Palestine in terms of date at December 10th or 11th, 1917. Meaning the Balfour Declaration was issued at a time where the British were not the sovereign or the occupying power of Palestine. They gave a land that does not belong to them, nor they had the authority to dispense of Palestine in any way or shape, even after they arrived. That's a very important, because the Balfour Declaration that is issued becomes the instrument by which the entry of a creation of a Zionist Jewish state into the body of public international law. The Balfour Declarations get to be incorporated in almost every agreement thereafter. And the Palestinians are not mentioned at all in the Balfour. Their only characteristic is the non-Jewish communities, and only their civil and religious rights are to be respected, meaning no political rights. So 97% of the population in Palestine were completely erased by the Balfour Declaration, and the creation of a Jewish homeland is articulated by the Balfour Declaration, which was a private letter. It's an official British promise, but a private letter that is sent to Rothschild to convey to the Zionist movement. So that's a very important dating of November 2nd, the Balfour Declaration. The British entry into Palestine is December 10th or 11th of 1917. Balfour Declaration gets to be incorporated into the Paris Peace Conference, the settlements of post-World War claims. Woodrow Wilson accepts the recognition of the Balfour Declaration, even though that people were saying President Wilson declared the 14 points of self-determinations and the new era, while domestically he was weakened and began to actually trudge and embrace some of the most pernicious aspects of the U.S. Racial discourse. He actually hosted the KKK, the viewing of The Birth of a Nation in the White House, which was one of the first full feature films, and began to embrace KKK types of white supremacy. But he accepted the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was also incorporated into the 1922 League of Nations mandate, thus allowing the British, who were given the mandate authority over Palestine, to begin to incubate a state within a state, meaning that it gave recognition to the mandate authority in Palestine to see to it the empowerment of the newly arriving Zionist settlers over Palestine. The main component of that initial aspect is what's called the Jewish Legion. In World War I, the British actually constituted a Jewish Legion that was allowed to participate as a unit in their Eastern Front, which meaning Palestine area. Once World War I concluded and the Paris Peace Conference concluded, that legion was maintained and incorporated into the mandate power authority in Palestine. That legion becomes the nucleus for the development of the Israeli army later on, because it is one that is trained, developed, given all the resources from the British during World War I, and maintained as part of the nucleus for the empowerment of the Zionists in Palestine. During the mandate, which lasts from 1922, 1917 to 22, the British are a colonial, not a colonial power, and the 1922 League of Nations gives them this cover of legitimacy under international legal structures, which was, for me, it was what you call the new and improved colonization, because the era of colonization was coming to an end, so they needed a new and improved, just like when you go and shop for a new shampoo, you say a new and improved version. So the new and improved version of colonization was to use the terminology of mandate, maintaining colonized population under the same colonial regime while using this euphemism of mandate. So from 1922 to 1948, it is the incubation period of the British. Now, why the British needed this period? Because when the British entered Palestine, the Jewish population was only 3%. 97% of the population was Arab, Palestinian Muslim, Christians, and also Palestinian Jews, which is something that also gets to be erased by the European Zionist movement because they don't give recognition to them as such. So there needed a period of incubation. Through it, there will be an increased Zionist migration to Palestine, an economic empowerment, giving all of the major economic projects in Palestine to Zionist outfits, sometimes directly and sometimes with a Western front, in a similar way today where Israel is often incorporated into many of the dynamics of Western countries. So you might be dealing with a Western company in the front, but in essence, it's almost intertwined with many of the Israeli companies, either direct investments or indirect influences. So that was economically empower them. Also giving them social, national standing in Palestine, incorporating them as on an equal footing with the Palestinians. Thus, the British actually fauceted the Zionist movement and Zionism on the Palestinians. In here, I may just depart on a side tangent. Often we see these coinage that has written on it Palestine, both in Arabic, English, and Hebrew. That is a modern development that the British actually brought in. As the mandate was brought in 1922, the coinage that was being published or being printed for the purpose of Palestine began to incorporate Hebrew as an official language of Palestine, even though that Hebrew as a language at the time, among the Jewish Palestinians, where their predominant language was Arabic, and therefore the introduction of Hebrew as a language within Palestine correspond to that moment, as well as the council that was created gave equal footing to the newly arriving Zionist movement. This is not to say that I'm not a person that actually accepts exclusivity of language. I think all languages are manifestation of God's on the world. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ اخْتِلَافِ أَلْوِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْسِنَتِكُمْ. That from the signs of your Lord is the differences of your skin tones and your language. But in here, language was a colonial instrument in the same way that the French enforced French language on the populations in North Africa and in the colonial territories as a way to civilize. So the coinage, I see that some people say here, Palestine is written in there in Arabic, but is also written in Hebrew and English, and that is a phenomena that is an outcome of the mandate authority and thus imprinting by the British on Palestine that particular type of epistemology, because prior to that, it was actually the Ottoman currency with Arabic being the insania. The new currency gets to be imprinted in that way. So that's part of really the incubation of Zionism. In addition, the British allowed for the settlements to have their own security forces, which means independent military militias that began to develop into terrorist militias. In particular, the Irgun and Stern gangs and the Haganah were actually in the early 1930s began to launch attacks on Palestinians. They attacked cafes, markets, attacked railroads, and so on. So some of the early bombings that exist in Palestine is all carried out by these major Zionist gangs that are allowed to have their own force, allowed training, allowed to have weapons. And they were all using the discourse of colonization. You know, modern Zionists today are loath to the term colonization or colonialism, but all of the founding members of the Zionist enterprise, from Chaim Weizmann to Herzl himself, Jabotinsky to Ben-Gurion, to Joseph Weitz from the Jewish Agency, all were using colonial language and all were committed to actually instrumentalizing and using violence as an instrument to get rid of the Palestinian population. The notion that Palestine was an empty land, a land without a people for a people without a land, that's a propaganda that gets to be developed both for the Western audience predominantly, but the Zionists themselves from the get-go understood that Palestine is heavily populated. It had almost every part of Palestine was claimed, so much so that when they sent their delegations to Palestine, the report came back that the bride is beautiful, but it's already betrothed, meaning that Palestine is a beautiful land and a beautiful place, but it's heavily populated and no foot, except that it has already people living in there. So the British made it possible to actually incubate a state within a state under the mandate. And from 1922 to 1948, where the British left in 1948, on May 14th, 1948, by the time they left, Palestine had become 35%, maybe 36% Jewish population, Jewish Zionist population, and then the Palestinian population making close to 64 or 65% of the population. The planning for the Nakba, I tend to date the Nakba from 1917. And it goes into stages. 1917 is the first part of the Nakba where the British begin to dismantle the Palestinian national identity, or they are denationalized, so they become spoken of as a civil and religious community rather than a national community at a time where in the region, again, I'm not in here arguing about nationalism or not, but all of the region, nationalism was the framework by which a new modern nation states to emerge. Palestinians were denationalized. And while the Zionist movement actually brought in from outside as a national entity to establish a project. So Zionism, in essence, is five-seated over the Palestinians. 1917 is the beginning of the Nakba. The second part of the staging or development of the Nakba occurs in 1936 to 39, which is also the great revolt in Palestine. And in that stage, the dismantling of Palestinian civil society occurs. Much of the Palestinian leadership is sent to exile. Almost 5,000 Palestinians actually are killed during that period. The British used air bombardment against Palestinians. Large numbers of people arrested, and also many are sent to exile. So you'll find Palestinians in Latin America, in Chile, El Salvador, Bolivia, Nicaragua are actually from that period being actually expelled or having to abandon their homes and lands to flee the what is taking place. So that begins the process of really setting in motion the takeover of Palestinian lands. And for the Zionists also, they developed at this period was called village files. Very important. The village files where they begin to map the community. Mapping the community who participated in the 1936 rebellion, who was part of a resistance movement, who is actually susceptible to be recruited as informant, who are the leaders that need to be actually pushed and killed at the time. All these village files actually gets to be developed, interestingly enough, with the support of universities that are formed at the time. So the culpability of the academic enterprise in Israel goes hand in hand from the early formation of the state. In a similar way, every colonial project that have occurred was actually anthropology was an instrument, political science was instrument, and many practitioners in academia have their hands bloodied with the colonial enterprise. So these village files becomes an instrument during the 1947-48 period for the actual implementation of the third stage of the Nakba, where 750,000 Palestinians get expelled, ethnically cleansed, and 532 villages completely wiped out, 11 urban centers completely emptied of all the population. And it is that landscape, that aspect of Palestinian society that Israel is built upon the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So they benefited from acts of ethnic cleansing, acts of genocide that occurred at the time, and massacres. Many in here, some of these Zionist spokespeople, not to give them credit, but I think logic is in short supply with them, but they say that we made the desert bloom, that we have created all this magnificent places and so on. The reality is, often Palestinians tell them, you took Palestine fully furnished. In a similar way that you take an Airbnb and you go and everything is there, they took Palestine fully furnished. Fully furnished, houses furnished, vineyards, streets, every infrastructure was there. So the notion that these colonial forces and colonial societies came to an empty desert, it fits the imaginations of Eurocentricity, right? Because Eurocentricity posits anything outside of Europe is the realm of the barbarians, that they needed to be civilized, we need to bring development. I'm sorry, that's not the case. Palestine has always been civilized, been the land of milk and honey, very well developed. A railroad system was in existence, built during the Ottoman era. Movie theater, not that they are standard, movie theaters were there. They had actually a Mercedes dealership also in existence in that period. So much so when they had the Irish famine, the Palestinians actually sent food aid to the Irish during the potato famine and the Irish famine. So the notion that all of a sudden some who came from the Ukraine as settlers, or those from Poland, or those from other parts came to Palestine and transformed it into making the desert bloom, I would say the opposite. They made the paradise of Palestine into one of the most destructive environmental cases that we see in our eyes. They transformed what was beautiful into literally structures of epistemological ugliness in front of us. Like, how can you go to Palestine and see that apartheid wall that crisscrossing 600 kilometers in one way or other? How can you actually begin to look where close to 1.5 million trees have been cut just to build this monstrosity that is called the apartheid wall? How can you actually visit the Dead Sea, which almost have lost 1/3 of its water, and its ice is going to almost go and disappear? How can you actually take a look at all of this transformation and posit it in essence that Israel is the pinnacle of civilization? Again, I don't want to take this as in a different direction, but this notion of civilizing the global South has been a foundational element within Western colonization, and Zionism is a type of Western colonization. It breathes Western epistemology. Actually, earlier today I was just reading a quote from the president of Israel, Herzog. He says that if we don't win the war against Hamas, it will be a loss, or it will be a loss to all of Western civilization. This is the same language that that the United States used in relations to Iraq. If we don't win the war, it's all of Western civilization, or Afghanistan, this place. When Gandhi was told about Western civilization, he said it's a good idea, and I still think that they might, think of that idea relative to what is taking place. So the British made it possible to incubate Zionism, and Zionism committed genocide in 1948 against the Palestinians. Benny Morris, who wrote his book about the Palestinian refugee problem, admitted to the genocide. He also, in another article thereafter, he says he arrived at a justifiable ethnic cleansing or a justifiable genocide. He said that if you need to make an omelet, you have to crack eggs. That's how he justified 750,000 Palestinians being expelled, ethnically cleansed, almost 120 massacres being committed. The largest of it is Deir Yassin, is seen as making an omelet, and the omelet that is being made is again the modern state of Israel with all its violence that is manifested against the Palestinians. So that's a very important, because most of the refugees in Gaza, some put the estimate at 70%. Some put the estimate at 80% of all the Gaza population are refugees that were expelled from their homes and lands in 1948. And therefore, they are looking at their homes and lands literally across the borders from Gaza, hoping and having expectation of right of return. to their homes, which is also, again, United Nations says that they have the right to return. Resolution 194, passed in post-World War, post-1948 war, said that the refugees have the right to go back to their homes and lands. Israel prevented their return to their homes and lands, despite the fact that you have a Resolution 194, which Israel accepted as a precondition to their admission into the United Nations, right? So 48 is the Nakba that dismantles and dispossesses the Palestinian population. Now, 48 is also an important point. The Gaza Strip comes under Egyptian control. The West Bank comes under Jordanian control. Now, it's important, immediately after the end of 48 war, the Palestinians actually held a meeting in Gaza and declared independence. The Jordanian government at the time, with communication and relations with the Israeli government at the time, facilitated that Jordan should be involved in annexing the West Bank to prevent the Palestinian state from emerging. Because again, for Zionism, the core is actually what's called Judea and Samaria for them, which is the West Bank. So Jordan actually called for a number of Palestinian dignitaries and held a meeting in Jericho, where those dignitaries spoke on behalf of the Palestinians who already declared independence in Gaza and called for becoming to be annexed by Jordan, become part of Jordan. So that's how the West Bank becomes part of Jordan, and then Palestinians in the West Bank get the Jordanian citizenship. There's a book on collusion across the Jordan River. It's a very important book that speaks about the relationship of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Israel and Zionism. They actually agreed on that relationship as early as 1922, when Transjordan was created as a way. So from 1922, there was an acceptance by the Hashemite, who were participant in the Great Arab Revolt and got to have both Jordan as part of their reward compensation, and also King Faisal was appointed to be king in Iraq. So both Jordan and Iraq were created as a result of the British machination. Iraq, King Faisal was brought in to torpedo the Iraqi nationalist movement at the time, to implement the British designs on Iraq. So that relationship prevented a Palestinian state from emerging in 1948, after the Palestinians actually declared independence. Interestingly enough, they did not actually see it to be exclusive. They welcomed everyone that would live with the Palestinians to actually be incorporated and welcome. And if even we go much earlier, I know these days many of these Zionists try to besmirk the name of the Palestinians, defame the Palestinians by indicating that the Palestinians were in support of Nazi Germany and so on. That is, again, reductionist, because the Palestinians actually, in their literature, in their news writing and so on, in Palestine, never actually accepted Nazi Germany, nor actually celebrated or indicated their affinity, anything relative to Nazi Germany. I take account of Haj Amin al-Husseini going and meeting with Hitler. Haj Amin al-Husseini was instrumentalized by the German in order to actually pacify and recruit Bosnian Muslims into the German army. So you have many of these what you call Zionists who possibly do not read more than what the ADL or AIPAC send them as talking points, and they think that smart aleck that they figured it out, so they go and yell about how Hitler was inspired by Haj Amin al-Husseini, talking about what you call the compounded ignorance of history, and also ignorance of the genesis of racism and anti-Semitism in Europe. Anti-Semitism in Europe is historical. You don't need Haj Amin al-Hussein or a Palestinian to tell the Europeans how they should be or how they have been anti-Semitic. Again, the history of Europe, there's about 1,030 pogroms that have been committed against the Jews in Europe. Right? And the history of Muslims and Jews is really, we should be talking about Judeo-Islamic tradition. again, set Zionism aside, the history of Jewish-Muslim relations is far more robust than anything closely resembling what we call is Judeo-Christian tradition. That's only an invention post-World War II. For the history of Jewish-Christian relations is the whole series of pogroms, death and destructions visited upon the Jewish population. You could take it from the Inquisition, you could take it even the Crusades. The Crusaders, as they came out of Europe, every time they passed by a city or a town that had Jewish population, they massacred the Jewish population. You could talk about the period of the, not the pandemic, for the word is escaping, the 14th century, the plague. It was projected that God is angry with the Christians in Europe because they're allowing the Jews to live among them. So they had a whole series of pogroms directed at Jews. We don't find any of this historical moments in Muslim Arab history, and I could point to every moment of conflict that existed, but in general there is no historical reference to these types of pogroms. So much so when, again, the Inquisition and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews in Europe, the Jews actually ended up migrating and living in the Muslim world as co-participant in the production of what we call, broadly speaking, Islamic civilization. So it's very important to remind these individuals that have reduced the Muslim Jewish history to only to speak of Muslim Palestinian Zionist history and try to project that back into history. This is actually doing disservice both to their history, to Jewish history, and also a disservice to narrating accurately the continued suffering that Jews have experienced at the hands of the Western world. And today the Western world arise as diplomats, masquerading that they are actually the ones that are going to resolve the conflict. Every time that a Western diplomat comes, they're either trying to sell you a weapon or trying to facilitate somebody else selling a weapon in order to expand their commercial economic interests. We're a military-industrial complex economy, and we need to understand that. I know I went a lot, 53 minutes. I wanted to cover maybe the latter period, but there's a lot of history to actually get into. Maybe I could spend a few minutes. The most recent development, again, people are following the news, but if I may jump to Oslo Agreement, which is based on the notion of land for peace or a two-state solution. Oslo Agreement did not actually framed of letting go of Israel, letting go of the occupied territories. The Oslo Agreement came at the end of the first Intifada and also the end of the first Gulf War. The United States, because it rallied the Arab world to be part of its coalition against Iraq, promised that they will facilitate the peace process to unfold, and they began with the Madrid Conference. And through the Madrid Conference, negotiations were taking place. A back channel was opened between Israel and the PLO through Norway that resulted in the signing of the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement basically said that Israel will recognize the PLO as the legitimate representative to negotiate with Israel, while the PLO under Yasser Arafat recognized